Hi, in this video I'm going to give you some ideas on how to create board games to use in class. Now, not all teachers like using board games, but plenty of them do for getting students interacting and talking and kind of playing the game, but also practicing their English. Some of the ideas that I'm presenting here come from the book I wrote with Lindsay Clanfield called Etepedia Materials Writing. In the photocopyable section at the back, we have all sorts of examples of games. Here's the past and present game. We include blank game pro formas, snakes and ladders, blank version of snakes and ladders, and then things like dominoes, happy families cards, story cards, all sorts of game-like activities. But in this particular video, let's focus on the board game in particular.
The basic principles of this: you need a board, you need a start and a finish place. You need winners if you play a game, although the winning aspect is probably less important. This is a template of a board game. Students have counters. It could be a pen top, a paper clip, whatever, just an object to represent themselves. They put it on start. Then they can either roll dice. Here's one problem: you need to remember to tell students to bring dice into class. Or they have a coin and they toss it. If it lands on heads, they move 2 squares. If they land on tails, they move 1 square. And they move around the board, and then the student gets to finish. You can add features to the board game. For example, I could make the board game more like Snakes and Ladders. If you're not familiar with Snakes and Ladders, if you land on the square at the bottom of the ladder, you go up the ladder. If you land at the head of the snake, you go down the snake. So it adds a slightly game-like activity to the board, but the basic principles are the same. And again, this comes from Etepedia Materials Writing. Me and Lindsay Clanfield include a blank template that you could create your board game by using the template in the book, and we also give you examples of the kinds of games you might use. Notice also how to play. The instructions are included with this board game, and I prefer it with board games to give students the instructions written on the page rather than leave it to the teacher to explain them. I think students reading the instructions should be part of the language learning aspect. Which brings us to the language learning aspect. Board games are good for speaking. They're good for revising vocabulary. So if you've been teaching some vocabulary, to design a board game which recycles the vocabulary is good. And you can also use it for grammar. And I've seen teachers write board games for pronunciation practice as well. Let's take a look at a finished board game. This comes from my book, World English Level 1, the 3rd edition from National Geographic Learning. This board game came at the end of a unit on the topic of food. As I say, board games can be quite space hungry on the page, but they do justify themselves because they take quite a while to finish. This one could easily take 15 minutes of a lesson. Very straightforward. You tell the students to read the instructions. The instructions just tell them to flip a coin and move 1 square or 2 squares. They have a start and a finish square. Obviously, when a game is designed up, it's nice if you can get some images or features added to the game to give it visual appeal. So obviously this board game has food items added to it. But let's now take a look at the key aspect of a board game, which is what happens when a player lands on a square. There's got to be some language work. The general rule for me is that less is more. The less you can have written on the square, the more productive it often is. So in this low-level board game, students had to say the names of 5 vegetables when they landed on square 1. So they were remembering what had come up in the unit. To add some interactivity to the board game, if a player lands on this square, they can ask any other player on the board, or in fact every player on the board. They could ask them a question with how many. So you could make this grammatical. They could choose between how much or how many to pick up on countable, uncountable nouns, or you just give them a prompt like this and students generate their own question. So what's written on the square can be quite controlled, or it can be quite open. Making it quite good and productive and useful for speaking type lessons. Remember though, it's still a game, So you still want game-like activities, and I like game-like activities like miss a turn or go forward 1 square or go back 1 square and link the instruction to whatever the topic of the game is. So in this case, it's to do with food, and if they're late for dinner, they miss a turn. And that way you just keep that game-like element. And so for students who like the whole competitive nature of games and want to win, you keep that game-like activity. For other students, it's just interesting to see gaming vocabulary. When you've written a few board games for your students and used them in class, you can also give students a template like this and say, now for homework, create your own board game, recycling language in some way from the previous few lessons. It's a nice activity.
Hope that was all useful and clear. Again, add your own ideas for games and things you've discovered about creating board games in the classroom. Add them to the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos or how-to videos on to do materials writing and creating materials in your own classrooms.